Welcome to the Going Within Fertility podcast, where three holistic health practitioners come together to explore the innate wisdom of the body and help you reclaim the power of your fertility journey. We're here to bridge the gaps in women's reproductive health, offering integrative perspectives so you can feel informed, empowered, and remind you that the ability to heal and thrive lies within. The information provided in this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. We encourage you to reach out to your trusted medical practitioner to discuss your unique health history and experiences. As always, you are the expert in your body's health. So listen deeply, go within, and let's move from the space where science and intuition meet.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad you're here for our second episode. As we begin diving into all things fertility, it only makes sense to start at the foundation, the menstrual cycle. Insight around your cycle is truly the cornerstone of understanding your fertility. And today we're talking all about cycle tracking, why it matters, what your body is telling you, and how this knowledge can empower you, whether you're trying to conceive or you just want to get more in tune with your health. Before we get in too deep, Darcy is our fertility awareness educator, and we're hoping that you can walk us through what cycle tracking actually is and how it's different from just noting how long is your period and when it begins.
Absolutely. So, tracking when your period begins and maybe even when it ends each cycle gives you information about your total cycle length and the number of days of bleeding. However, there are so many other elements of the menstrual cycle that give us incredible data about how our hormones are functioning, when and if our body's ovulating, which is truly the most important element of your cycle, whether or not you're actually trying to conceive, and can even give us insights into other bodily functions like thyroid health, immune health, digestive health, things like that. So, when you're tracking your cycle, you might be noting the days that you're bleeding, how much you're bleeding, the days that you're observing signs of fertility, like the presence of cervical mucus. Perhaps you're using an at home urinary hormone test, such as an ovulation predictor kit that might look at the hormones estrogen and luteinizing hormone, or even a hormone testing kit that could look at the hormone progesterone after ovulation, as well as tracking your daily waking temperature, which is called your basal body temperature. Now, you don't need to be tracking all of these different elements, but by collecting consistent data over a series of cycles, you may be able to detect particular patterns for your body and get a sense of whether or not your menstrual cycle may fall within the range of normal, or what we call the expected parameters. So, this is really helpful when we are assessing our overall hormonal health and fertility, because ultimately, the menstrual cycle is one of our body's vital signs. Research has shown that when menstrual cycles consistently fall outside of these expected parameters, it's an indication of an underlying dysfunction. So, tracking your menstrual cycle is really giving you insight into your overall body's health. And then, I guess just to go a little bit further, there's also something called a fertility awareness method. So, this is a standardized approach to cycle tracking. There are several different types of fertility awareness based methods, which you can learn either through an instructor or through written material to follow a specific protocol when tracking your cycle. But you don't have to use a standardized fertility awareness method to track these elements of your cycle.
Love hearing you use it as like a vital sign reference, Darcy, because I think, just understanding how the cycle goes and how it relates to your whole health is good. And it kind of brings me back to when I was first tracking my cycle and trying to understand like all the ups and downs of it. Would you go into a little bit of what a normal cycle kind of looks like and the days that it goes with?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we might expect to see with a menstrual cycle is menstruation, so your period happening once every, maybe 25 to 35 days or so. And you can have periods that come more frequently or less frequently than that, but 25 to 35 days is considered like the moderate or average cycle length. We would expect to see you bleed for maybe 3 to 7 days, and you'd probably fill somewhere between like 4 to maybe 15 or 16 regular absorbency pads or tampons during that entire time frame. Then, within a few days of your period ending, or maybe a couple of weeks after it ends, we would expect for you to begin observing signs of cervical fluid. So, if you've ever noticed when going to the bathroom and wiping, sometimes there's this like creamy or white fluid, or perhaps it looks more clear, slippery, stretchy. You might see it on the toilet paper or even in your underwear at the end of the day. This is cervical fluid, and it's a sign from your body that your ovaries are in the midst of maturing egg cells and your estrogen levels are rising. So, this is a sign that you are in your fertile window. And we would expect to see this fluid at least once a day for 3 to 7 days, right around ovulation. And if you were testing with those urinary test strips that look at the hormones estrogen and LH, you'd probably see those values rise and fall somewhere around this time. Ovulation should happen about 10 to 15 days before your next period. And the two ways that we can confirm ovulation are either through tracking your daily waking temperature, which is your basal body temperature, or through testing for the hormone progesterone. Progesterone is a hormone that our body makes in elevated levels only after ovulation. And progesterone increases our body's basic metabolic rate, so our core temperature will rise subtly. If we are tracking our temperature every morning throughout the cycle, we would notice that our waking temperature elevates by maybe a half of a degree or even up to a full degree higher in the days after we have ovulated. So, with cycle tracking, we're collecting data about certain symptoms or observations that we might be making about our body throughout the menstrual cycle. And it can even go as deep as just noticing, your changes in mood or energy or appetite. You can really make cycle tracking your own by just getting curious about what your body might be experiencing from cycle to cycle.
It's hard because a lot of the times, especially within the context of cycle tracking and fertility, it's normal until it's not. And I have this conversation a lot where you can see one offs and you can say, well, sometimes my cycle looks like this and sometimes my cycle looks like that. And I heard that it really is ideal to be closer to 28 days or have a 5 day or 6 day cycle, actual period bleed. And so we kind of talk about this because a lot of the times I always call it, if it's a one off, it's a one off, and sometimes it's the way the wind blows, but not really. But sleep and hydration and stress levels and nutrition changes and exercise changes can really alter these hormones that you're talking about throughout our cycle. And so it is something that I want to make sure that people understand as far as yes, those are these wide parameters of normal. And then, depending on who you ask, maybe there is some kind of secret optimal range that those of us who do a lot of functional medicine kind of harp on. But my caveat is always that it depends on the person, and one person's optimal is really never gonna be someone else's. One thing that I heard you say, Darcy, was cervical fluid, and I tend to call it cervical mucus, and when I heard you say that, I thought, "Oh, well, maybe mucus is more so the inhibitory mucus that keeps sperm out." Is there a reason why you use that term?
To use them interchangeably because the fluid that the cervix produces that is estrogenic in nature, that changes the pH of the vagina to allow the sperm cells to live in there and move and get into the cervix and into the uterus and yada yada. Like that fluid can show up in so many different or with so many different characteristics. Sometimes it looks like mucus, it looks like boogers, like it's gelatinous and it's, goopy. And sometimes it's super watery in nature and there's a little bit of a slippery element to it. Or sometimes it looks like toothpaste or lotion, right? And so I use both terms, but I like to use cervical fluid because I think it also helps to normalize. Like if someone's experience is that they don't get that classic goopy, stretchy egg white, it doesn't mean that or raw egg white, right? Like it doesn't mean that their body is not quote unquote doing what it's supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for clarifying. And that kind of leads me to another question that I had for you regarding a lot of referrals that I see when we're seeing some of the same clients. You'll kind of be working with them, helping them go throughout these cycle tracking parameters. And I have a lot of people who come and say, hey, do I need to look at my thyroid? And it seems like sometimes that they're seeing, maybe less noticeable cervical fluid changes. Can you talk to me a little bit about these signs and when you consider referring?
Yeah. So there's lots of different reasons as to why someone may have like less cervical mucus production. And so anytime we're noticing something kind of fall outside of that expected range, right? And like looking for that pattern. So it's not just a one-off, but we're like, okay, here it comes again and again and again. Then we can say, okay, the body is telling us something, right? And so then we have to do our detective work and figure out, well, what might be causing that. And so, there are these patterns that we might see in regards to suboptimal menstrual cycle expression, right? That can be correlated with suboptimal thyroid function. And more commonly, or I think perhaps more obviously, we might see the basal body temperature ranges be relatively low in folks who are having lower thyroid function. So that may be a reason that, I might make that referral and say, this is interesting, right? Or there may be indications that the body is trying to ovulate, but is not succeeding, or the body is ovulating, but all of the elements that lead up to that ovulation that can allow that expression of vibrant health, if those things aren't falling into place, then again, that's when we have to do the detective work. And it may be, there just may be other systems within the body that are needing a little bit more support. Let alone, there's often a lot of nutrients that if the body is not getting enough of, we might see you know more of an issue with thyroid function, or we might see less cervical mucus. There's a lot of overlap with some of those nutrients.
Yeah, I'll kind of speak to that on the nutrition side of things. If someone's on a really low carb diet or a really low calorie diet, or maybe they're exercising too much, we'll see that the body kind of down regulates ovulation, and a lot of those things that are needed for pregnancy just don't quite, you know, get up to speed. And so I think especially with diet culture the way it is, it's always good to make sure people are nourishing themselves enough. I think if you think back to the way Mother Nature designed the whole system, it makes sense if we were cave people and there was a famine, or maybe there was lions chasing us all the time. It wouldn't be a good time to procreate. Can't really run away from a lion when you're 9 months pregnant. So if there's a really stressful environment, we'll see some things happening there with ovulation. But nutrients as well, there kind of needs to be this abundance of nutrients, because if you're bringing another mouth into the world and there's not enough to feed you what you have right now, then that's another reason that we'll see the body down regulate that ovulation process.
Yeah. And I would even say, sometimes, yes, of course, sometimes we don't even see ovulation happening. And that's a huge red flag, right? But then sometimes we do see ovulation happen. But then that luteal phase, so the second phase of the cycle after ovulation is called the luteal phase, in reference to the corpus luteum, which is a gland that produces that progesterone after ovulation. Um, Sometimes the luteal phase might be shorter, or there might be a bunch of premenstrual symptoms that show up in that time frame. And a lot of the times, I'm often talking about nutrition and nourishment and rest and stress management, because that's the phase of the cycle. Even if we are able to ovulate, then depending on what the luteal phase health is looking like, that may give us more insight into, well, is it enough, right? Like, are we just scraping by? Are we like doggy paddling our way there? Or are we actually in a place where our body is totally capable of doing this, and doing this with extra resources? So the luteal phase health, I think, is always a really interesting one to be looking at.
This is a big topic. I know with everyone that we talk to, but specifically me with the hormones, right? If we're actually going to test them, what does it look like, and what are we going for when we see these things? And so, one of the things I like to talk about is, of course, when we test. And if you're using some of these urine at home tests that look at the metabolites, we really get a great picture, especially comparing over multiple cycles where people are averaging out, which is great. But the standard of care from the conventional fertility world is always D3 labs. And I guess if we're going back to the highlight that the menstrual cycle and the first day of your period is a vital sign. And that actually means the first day of true bleeding, where you're needing to use protection versus a little bit of spotting or lighter bleeding. This might be a sign that we have what we call a luteal phase defect or some low progesterone. And the way that I really think about it is, sure, we can look at your urine metabolites, we can look at your day 3, and for progesterone, we wanna do it 7 days after suspected ovulation. So once you see those body temperature changes, once you see the luteinizing hormone peak, then we're gonna look at progesterone. And depending on who you ask, it's 3 or 5, ideally 5, to kinda say, "Yay, you ovulated." That luteal spike was 12 to 24 hours before actual ovulation occurred. And then again, depending on who you ask, there's some optimal maybe progesterone levels that might be even higher. Then okay, fine, you did ovulate, but maybe they're not quite sustainable, or maybe it's not quite progestation enough to facilitate a healthy and, unfortunate word, viable pregnancy. So we talk about that, but more often than not, we don't necessarily see highs and lows on the actual blood tests. And I say that's okay. We're looking for patterns, but it often is, sure, maybe estrogen is a little bit high and it's not flagged because the range is huge. And we talk about that. But really, in my mind, for most of us, it comes down to this ratio of estrogen to progesterone. And that ratio changes because of all the things we talked about, but more so toxins in our environment. Many things mimic estrogen and, unfortunately, skew that ratio. So we're seeing some symptoms of high estrogen or low progesterone, which can exist in and of themselves, but often are a result of the spectrum of the ratios being slightly off. And so it's so cool that we can help people to identify that these things are going on in their cycle or not. And I guess for you, Darcy, I'm curious how you recommend, as far as people who are considering trying to conceive, how long you say, okay, well, this is when we should really start looking at your cycle before you even start trying. And are there certain methods that you recommend for this cycle tracking?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I guess this goes back to this concept of like, let's see patterns show up, right? So we want to be able to, I guess, in in some ways, like check all the boxes, right? So look at all of these elements of the menstrual cycle. Are they falling into, kind of the ranges that we might expect to see? And are they doing that again and again and again? Is the storyline the same, right? Or is the story saying this one particular thing keeps falling outside of what we would expect? Or these handful of things aren't showing us the same pattern again and again. So that takes time, right? So I generally, there's kind of twofold. So I generally encourage people to be supporting their bodies through nourishment, through stress management, through optimizing sleep, through, lifestyle elements, right? I encourage people to spend about 3 months making all of those adjustments prior to trying to conceive, because we know that on average, it takes about 3 cycles to slowly mature an egg cell and get it ready for ovulation. So we want to build that strong foundation where we are giving the body everything that it needs. So when we're at the point where we are expecting our body to, like, quote unquote perform, right? Like, okay, let's get pregnant. Like, we want to know that that egg cell that we might be ovulating that cycle has had everything it's needed in order to get to that place. So that's one reason why I might make that recommendation of about 3 months, 3 cycles before trying to conceive, to just start looking at your cycle, right? But actually tracking your cycle, I also think that at least 3 cycles is really important to work with, because it allows us to get the very beginning stages of seeing a pattern. If we're tracking for 1 cycle and then our body doesn't do exactly the same thing the next cycle when we're like ready to start trying to conceive, it can get a little bit confusing. So after 3 cycles, you might be able to see, okay, this is kind of my average cycle length, or this is generally around when I have previously seen signs of ovulation or when I first see cervical fluid. So I think that tracking for 3 cycles and making those adjustments to support our system in a really optimized way during those 3 cycles. Like, I would say 3 cycles is kind of the minimum. in an ideal world.
Darcy, I was going to ask, like, when you are tracking cycles, are you also tracking kind of like, daily activity, stress level? Are you tracking, your mood and all of that? Or how does that kind of work?
It depends on the person. So, there are so many cycle tracking apps out there, and some of them are totally customizable, and some of them already have these prompts of like, did you exercise today? Or did you take your, multivitamin or whatever, right? So someone might be choosing to track all of these things, but it also can get really overwhelming to track all of these things all at the same time,
Yeah.
especially if you haven't been cycle tracking before. But this is where working with a fertility awareness educator can be helpful because we're looking at your charts and I'm, doing the like deep dive into the chart. I'm then doing the big zoom out with the chart. And I might prompt someone, I might ask those questions of, hey, what was going on April 18th, 19th? Like I will sometimes pick out timeframes and then they'll look back at their calendar and they'll go, oh my gosh, right. Yeah, I just pulled that all night or I had that, deadline done. And so sometimes there are things that we might or I might see in the chart that indicate that like gives me an indication of okay, stress or exercise, right? I might ask those questions of did you make an adjustment, like Bethany was saying earlier, like changes to exercise or nourishment, like that these stress levels, all of these things can influence the cycle. So I think it's really helpful, it can be helpful sometimes to track those things, especially if we know that this is something, either if we know that we've just made a big change. So maybe we're, training for a half marathon, or maybe we are making some dietary changes because we think this might help our body. One of the best ways to figure out if it's helping your body is track it with your cycle and see how your cycle is responding within the next 3 months. So yeah, sometimes that all of that gets tracked, and other times it's just so much.
I love that. I find that bringing it back to symptoms and really focusing on how it makes you feel, it's kind of fun sometimes too, because when you see something like that come up in the chart or ask about, okay, what has been going on over the last 3 to 6 months? And maybe they do notice, well, I traveled or I went to a wedding and I had so much fun and so many sweets and so much alcohol. And okay, we expect to see some of these changes. And I agree, especially when thinking about nutritional recommendations. I myself, when I follow a higher fiber, more plants, phytoestrogen containing veggies, I do find that flow is a little bit easier. We're not dealing with as much clotting as far as the actual period goes. And that is my favorite thing about you both is teaching people to realize for themselves what does and does work for them.
Yeah, and I think that, sometimes it takes baby steps too, right? If someone is, coming to me and maybe they've been tracking elements of their cycle for a while and they're like, okay, either this is a particular concern that I have, or I'm preparing, I want to start trying to conceive at such and such a time. We will start to, add into, right? Like we will look at what they're doing and we will build upon that when necessary. But if someone is coming to me and they like maybe they know generally, maybe they're tracking the start and end of their period, or even just the first day of their period, and that's it, right? I'm not going to come in here and be like, okay, here's 47,000 things for you to be tracking, and let's do that, and we'll meet next month, right? So oftentimes, you know, I teach a standardized fertility awareness method. And when folks are working with me one on one, that's the method that I teach them. And we're meeting with one another with some frequency. And there's this process of slowly learning how to, both utilize or how to learn the standardized approach and utilize it and apply it, right? And interpret based on that standardized approach. But when I'm in clinic with someone and, they're just coming to me because they're like, well, I think I'm ready to start trying to conceive, or, I think I have irregular cycles. I usually at that point just start at what I would consider like cycle tracking, right? So not necessarily diving into, this standardized method. And there are lots of benefits. And there are times where I might make a recommendation after someone has started to track some elements of their cycle. I may start to make a recommendation of, hey, I think it could really benefit you if we use this particular standardized method to really get into the nitty gritty here. And there are other times where, folks don't necessarily need to get that deep with their cycle tracking to really understand their patterns. And so, just like with any client care, right, we have to show up to that person in that moment and understand, what their needs are, understand what they are seeking. Like, how can we actually help them? Not go in with a plan and be like, this is what we do, right? But to go in with curiosity on our end and to find out, like, what are you seeking? What are your questions? What are you looking for help with? And then building upon that.
Yeah, I think because you mentioned a lot about the cycle tracking for fertility, but I think it's also really useful just in general for really all women. I mean, I had a hysterectomy prior to ever tracking my cycle, which made it really interesting just to be able to still know that, hey, I'm still ovulating and all these things are still happening, which doesn't always happen. But even like endometriosis, being able to see the signs of that on how your period comes and spotting and different things like that, and just the color. And I think it's all interesting, but I think it really helps you just know more about your body and have that knowledge. And I'll let you speak a little bit more about the non-fertility side of tracking cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's tracking your cycle to try to conceive, right? Then there's, using a standardized fertility awareness method to avoid conceiving. So using it as a like natural contraceptive approach, right? And then there is tracking your cycle for your overall health. And, you know, the app that I use right now to track my cycle, I love that it asks me that question, at the end of every cycle, or maybe you're supposed to do it at the beginning of the cycle, of like, what's your goal here, right? Like, are you using this to try to conceive, to try to avoid? Are you using this just to collect your health data? And yeah, cycle tracking, even if you are not actively trying to conceive, or maybe you're using some other method of contraception, or maybe you're not needing to use contraception, right? Um, then again, you can totally go into the cycle tracking for your own body awareness, because there may be symptoms that show up throughout your cycle. I would say a lot of the time, people are more attuned to the disruptive elements of our cycle, right? So the premenstrual symptoms that might be showing up, or maybe it's really evolving into premenstrual syndrome or into premenstrual dysphoric disorder, right? PMDD. And so, even just starting to, look at, well, what are all of the elements in my day-to-day life, right? So, what does my sleep look like? What does my nourishment look like? How are my stress levels? What is my movement practice like? All of these pieces influence the menstrual cycle. And so we might be looking at all of these elements and how are they impacting this one particular element of the cycle that we're saying, like, oh, these headaches that I get right before my period, or oh my gosh, I feel like I'm a totally different person. My partner says like I'm a totally different person in the 4 days, before my period. Or maybe, yeah, maybe there is some spotting that's showing up and someone's like, what is this? And so there are so many reasons to be tracking your cycle, let alone, even just, this is where it kind of gets into what I would consider like the fun stuff. Like when you start to notice, your energy levels shifting, right? And there's almost like these superpowers that we have access to, like in the different phases of the cycle. And once you start to identify how you show up as your best self in those phases of the cycle, sometimes, you can, this is what's like referred to as like cycle syncing, where you can start to, kind of map out perhaps your month based on some of these trends that you might expect, right? So you might be able to put up a lot of weight in the gym in your follicular phase, right? You might be able to really show up so well, kind of at the drop of a hat at that work meeting and, slay that whatever you're doing, right? So these things might be happening at your ovulatory phase, right? in your luteal phase, this may be the time that you start to go, a little bit deeper into creative projects, right? And so might be the time where you're kind of dreaming and doing the brainstorming, the brain dump. It's not the time for action, it's the time for like just thinking about it, right? And yeah, it might be the time where, you can do those like low energy but meticulous projects of like do the spreadsheets or whatever, right? And so yeah, just having this awareness of there are these different energetic shifts that happen. There are these time frames where I'm at my best in these various ways of my expression or these different elements of my life. And we don't have to be, in fact, we're not physiologically meant to be exactly the same person from day to day. That's like kind of one of the most amazing things I think about the, you know, female reproductive process is that hormonal cycle generally lasts about a month and it ebbs and it flows and it changes. When we look at the male reproductive cycle, that's a 24-hour cycle and it rises and it falls and it rises and it falls. And it's, it's like our world is set up to be this more masculine, like, yep, you exercise in the morning. And then at the end of the day, you go and have, cocktail hour or whatever as your energy, goes down. Right. And so there's this expectation that, well, I should be able to get up at 6 a.m. and exercise, right? Well, maybe not in your luteal phase when your body needs a little bit more rest and might need a little bit more nourishment. So those are the fun things about cycle tracking.
I think it's nice because when you can understand your own body's rhythm, it also helps you give grace for when you feel like you're not your best. If you have a low energy day or just not feeling the gym, but you know what's happening in your cycle, it can give you that little grace, or that you can push yourself extra on different days. So yeah.
And then it becomes a language. I mean, maybe I'm putting myself into a box here because I'm a fertility awareness educator, but this also is just something that is so like such a common language within my friend group as well, to be like, I am a luteal girl, like, I am not, gonna get this done, or like, you would not imagine what happened, blah, blah, blah. Well, yep, luteal, right? Or I'm follicular and like, I can take on anything, right? It helps. It's a lens, right? It just kind of gives that insight. And yes, I love what you're saying there, Jess, of like, give ourself compassion, just have that awareness of there's an ebb and there's a flow and there's a time and there's a place for kind of all of it.
Like you have said, one of the blessings in disguise of this whole cycle tracking is starting to learn and learning for yourself exactly what those symptoms mean for you. And then you get to know your cycle rather than looking at one of these charts and saying, oh my gosh, what hormone is blue or pink or what?
Yeah, totally. And I think, it kind of depends on where you're starting, right? Are you starting with, I don't even know how frequently I get a period? Or are you starting with, oh, I know exactly what day my estrogen rises and my LH rises and my progesterone rises, right? So I think that you get to decide for yourself, like what, I guess, version of cycle tracking you might be doing based on what your goals are. So, I mean, if you're just looking at, I'm going to track my menstrual phase. So I'm just going to track, when I get my period, how many days it lasts, and that's it. You're tracking, your menstrual phase of the cycle. For folks who are trying to conceive, they tend to focus a lot on that, follicular, late follicular phase into that ovulatory phase, kind of utilizing that time frame and making sure that everything is happening in the way that they think it ought to be happening, or are they seeing the things right? So there often is a lot of focus in that phase of the cycle. I mean, I guess not to go on too much of a caveat, but that also is the phase of the, the cycle where it's like the most quote unquote like productive time. It's the most creative thing like our body is capable of doing, right? And so it's also the phase of the cycle that often gets kind of glorified, right? Like we're so productive, we're so strong, we're so outgoing, like show up in capitalism that way, right? So there's often a lot of focus on that version. Ovulation, though, is really just, I mean, I think of it as like a moment in time. It's just this like bloop, the egg has popped out of the ovary and it is there, right? Like ovulation is just this culmination of all of that creative process, like leading up to pop, there goes the egg, right? And then there's the luteal phase, that follows after that. And again, if you are experiencing premenstrual symptoms, you might be focusing a lot on your luteal phase in ways that someone who might not have those symptoms might really not be paying a lot of attention to. But yeah, I guess also things to remember what these phases are if you're wanting to. The follicular phase is in reference to the follicles, so the little sacs that surround the egg cells, their development. So the follicular phase is the development of the follicles and the eggs. And the luteal phase is the evolution of that corpus luteum gland that's producing progesterone and estrogen at that time. So yeah, those are kind of like the different phases of the cycle. So, like, to wrap things up, tracking your cycle, you can decide how in depth you want to go with it. And I think mapping out what your goals are and understanding what you're looking to get out of it can really help you to determine how you're going to track your cycle, what elements of your cycle you're going to track, and are you looking for support in that process for understanding it, right? And so that's when, reaching out to fertility awareness educator or an integrative or a functional, practitioner who might have this knowledge can be really helpful.
You know what? I do want to ask you, Darcy, because as far as naturopathic, functional, and conventional medicine goes, I don't think I've ever heard somebody say the same thing twice about when to time intercourse if you're actually trying to conceive. So that is its own little journey. And we know that this fertile window kind of corresponds to, depending on who you ask, 5 days before and maybe the day after. Do you have a spiel around that since we are, say we're in the mindset of trying to conceive?
Yeah, absolutely. So this could be its own episode, I'm sure, but your body's signal that sperm cells are able to get into your reproductive system is your cervical fluid, because the vagina, kind of most days of the cycle, is too acidic of an environment for sperm cells to live in. But when our cervix is making this cervical fluid, it like shifts the pH just slightly to allow sperm cells to survive. That cervical fluid also secretes little sugars and proteins to keep the sperm cells alive. It is the active transport process. Like when you look at it under a microscope, you can see these like swimming lanes basically for the sperm cells to move. So when you start to see that cervical fluid show up, your body is saying, hey, we are fertile. Sperm can live here today. And if the sperm cells connect in with that cervical fluid, they can survive for 3 to 5 days. So you kind of have this little buffer zone of 3 to 5 days after that, deposit of seminal fluid into that into that cervical mucus, right? You've got 3 to 5 days where, like, well, if ovulation happens in this window, there's a chance of conception. So your fertile window begins with the first day you see cervical fluid. And then technically, the egg cell is viable on average for about 12 to 24 hours after ovulation. So that's where that kind of like once you've confirmed ovulation and you're a day or so after ovulation, that's when the fertile window ends. And so one of the challenging pieces about tracking your cycle is that we don't ever get to know exactly when ovulation is happening, right? Because there's all of these kind of statistical ranges and an expectation of, oh, based on the last day of cervical fluid or based on the LH surge or based on the temperature shift, this is where we expect ovulation to happen. But when you really dig into the research, then it's the bell curve, right? Like there's then bodies fall on this side of it or that side of it. And we don't ever we can't confirm ovulation until after it's happened. Like we then have to see the progesterone rise, or we have to see the temperature rise, and we have to see a pattern of that showing up, right? So, oftentimes I encourage people like start having intercourse the first day you see cervical fluid, and then your fertile window ends once you can confirm ovulation. So maybe the third high temperature or the third day, after your LH surge or after that fluid goes away.
That's really interesting. Thank you for kind of really going into detail there. I think that really helps people think about, all of the different signals that they do get in their cycle and during the ovulation and all of that, and being able to really hone in on that fertility window there.
Absolutely amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I am curious, as I'm sure a lot of people probably are if they're listening, how do you go about finding a fertility awareness educator?
The internet. I would say that most people find fertility awareness educators online. So there is an organization called the Association of Fertility Awareness Professionals, and that can be a really good place to learn about various fertility awareness based methods where you can link, to various fertility awareness educators, learn a little bit more about them. But yeah, I mean, I would say oftentimes it's a Google search, and that is how people find their fertility awareness educators.
Thank you. And I will look forward to speaking with you both again soon on our next episode.
Yes, definitely. It was great chatting with you ladies as always.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Going Within Fertility. If you're inspired by anything you've heard or would like to work with Dr. Bethany Nothurda, Jessica Doyle, or Darcy Black on your hormonal health or fertility journey, visit our website at goingwithinfertility.com to learn more. And don't forget to like, subscribe, or share this episode with a friend. See you next time.